Hello, art historians, and we are wrapping up, sorry, I can't talk today, wrapping up our final part of this unit by going into the art of indigenous South America, which will unfortunately suffer a large part of the same fate as the Aztecs are going to once the Spanish colonizers arrive over from Europe. But we're going to wrap this up by heading to South America, specifically along the western coast, around where Peru is today, and looking at the art and very impressive art and architecture of this particular culture. So I like to call this, whenever I talk about the Aztecs in this area, Pre-Columbian Classicism, which means like before the arrival of Columbus showed up, we did have major empires that were establishing major classical belief systems that they probably would have kept going, but hopefully not with the human sacrifice element that we saw before. And they had art and architecture that went with that. And I just feel that history, as a history teacher, Americas have a very bad habit of being left out of the story. Like basically they're talked about when the Europeans show up kind of as an afterthought. And I just don't think that that's right. When the Incan civilization is definitely one of the most advanced in the world at the time, what they were doing in their civilization mirrors, if not beats, what Rome was doing. In fact, what's more impressive is Rome didn't have the terrain struggles that the Incas did and how challenging their environment was, but the Incas made it work. Like they settled in this very sacred area that sits between like basically two mountain ranges, two rivers, an ocean and jungle, and they made it fit and they made it work. And they had huge, culture. They had these major beliefs, things that they were doing that the art and architecture definitely reflect those things. And we have to remember that there was this great legacy going on here before the arrival of the Europeans. So I really do need to point out that just like with the Aztecs and the Olmec mother civilization, like the Americas followed the same pattern that, we've seen in Europe and Asia and India with the birth of the first civilizations, particularly around a water source. And then those civilizations, sometimes they get overthrown and then they get taken over by other areas or other nomadic groups. And then those develop into massive complex empires with major belief systems and major economic systems. And the Americas were no different. The Aztecs start out with the Olmecs, we get the Mayas, and eventually we get the Aztec civilization or empire. In South America, we have the Moshi and we have the Chavin, and then that will develop into the Incas. And because so many of those belief systems transfer over time, the art and architecture will with it. So we see these parallels of what was going on over here in the Americas. They just got their start much later because in terms of migration, that's going to take a little bit farther coming over from the Americas or, Africa and working your way down. So we do know that just like other places, religion and rule are going to be very closely combined. We've seen that with the Maya. We've seen it with the Aztec. Very polytheistic, which most early religious systems were, especially being in touch with nature, which they so heavily depended on. The sun god is going to be a huge deal with the Incas, which may be also having to do with the fact that they're along the equator, so the sun was a much more constant presence in their life. But any place that starts out with agriculture, they're going to have that connection to the sun. It's going to be a big part of who they are. So that idea of upwards and connecting this world with the next world and understanding the macrocosmic forces of the universe is going to be a very big deal to them. So we're going to see a lot of parallels with what is going on in the Americas in connection to what's going on in other parts of the world, even though they never would have seen each other prior to this. So where you are is who you are. We've talked about this multiple times with the way that cultures develop because of their geography, that the fact that India and China are so unique in the way that they did things because they were geographically isolated. And we talked about American art was divided up into those three regions. So you had North America, which was much more nomadic and settled a lot later because that area was much colder for a very long time. Mesoamerica, which is going to be kind of the oldest, and then South America to like this area down here. Now, this area is, in terms of terrain, very, very rough, and they're going to have to make it work because there's mountain ranges, there's jungles, there's a lot of rivers, and there's not a lot of interaction between these three areas of North America, Mesoamerica, and South America because it really was difficult to have a lot of contact there. And they had domesticated pack animals, but more like llamas and camel-like creatures, not necessarily so much like our big oxen or horse or anything like that. So in terms of what is considered to be important in art or valuable, it really depends on what is available. So for example, in Mesoamerica, those rare birds that formed the Aztec feather headdress, like those were rare. So therefore, for royalty to have them showed their visual importance because not everybody could have it. Same thing in South America. Like it really depends on the material, because some materials are going to be much less available than others. And therefore, to have them would show your status. All right, so that's kind of a big part of this. So we have to start out, when we talk about South American, what they tend to refer to is called Andean art, because it really bases around these civilizations and empires that were settled in the Andes Mountains. And settling here was probably a deliberate choice for spiritual reasons. We've talked about so often the idea of sacred mountains and how important those mountains are, and this idea of their connection between this world and the next world, and where humans and spirits could connect, or where spirits actually lived. So the first advanced civilization that we have in the Andean region, or in the Andes Mountains, was the Chavin. And the Chavin at Chavin de Hontar set up this beautiful, beautiful place of religious significance. It's located on two rivers that converge there. It's settled between two different mountain ranges, one that had snow and one that did not. So basically, you're putting this at the very center of this civilization. It was everything to them. And the Chavin are going to kind of be the mother culture, very similar to what the Olmecs were in Mesoamerica, that are going to influence others. Now, the reason why Chavin de Hontar is going to be so influential on other places is because this was a religious pilgrimage site where people from all over South America would come and gather. So like 700 different groups of people would travel to Chavin de Hontar for this religious site, because the location was religious. Like the entire site of it, it had to be spiritual. So this basically became this pilgrimage site. And as people came here and saw the art that was affiliated with the religion of this area, they're going to take that with them, and it's going to spread and become popular in other parts of South America. So just to show you what we're looking at, like this is what the Andes Mountains appear to be. Like they're this beautiful, majestic thing that would just be awe-inspiring to the people who were living here in what would be today modern Peru. So you've got to understand, in South America, this environment is everything. You've got three very challenging ecosystems. Like you've got mountains, you've got desert, you've got rainforest. And so if you were able to get a hold of something like, or a material that didn't necessarily appear in those areas, that was, difficult to get to, that could denote status. It wasn't just what it was what it was made of. The medium is going to have extreme importance. So like, for example, birds, not very common. So if you had something made of feathers, that was huge. There aren't a lot of animals. There are some, but there's not much. So to have something made of wool or fabric or textiles, that was a very big deal. In fact, the women who would produce these textiles would often be sequestered away and like hidden away, because this was such a sacred, important skill that they had to create things out of textiles like this, like to weave and create those kind of goods, and even more if they were complex designs. And greenstone, remember, that's everywhere in the Americas. That color green, with the fact that it's life-giving, and the color of corn and food and earth, that was a big deal. So middle importance is going to be things made of metals like copper or, iron ore, bone, or obsidian. So like obsidian is like that black stone. So that was more common, especially in mountain ranges. You would find some of those things more often, like through mining, but not really as much of a big deal as the other things that were more rare. And of course, at the bottom were ceramics, which can be made out of clay, and wood, which was available. So Andean art is very terrestrial. Like it's very based on the environment. It's based on the earth, which they relied upon so much in these precarious environments that they were living in. they're very big into like this idea of the afterlife and this idea of the soul going to somewhere else, and they were actually mummifying like long before the Egyptians were. So just like with Egypt, like we think Egypt is this advanced civilization, the Incas were doing the same thing. Like we see so much of their art was made for burial goods to go into the afterlife. And shamanism is also going to be very common there for these priests to be able to communicate with the spirit world. And that animal nature does continue. It's very much a American, North Meso and South American thing, like this idea of animals, like people turning into animal selves or transitioning into these animals. So in like the Aztec culture, it's you were named for them. So like in North America, you had your animal spirits because the animals have been around much longer, so they're much wiser. So you want to embody their spirit. Mesoamerica, we have like bird jaguar and shield jaguar, and you kind of represent it through your name, who you are in these attributes. But in South America, it was almost like this transition of humans into animals, like becoming that, almost in the afterlife. So the place that's going to kind of be the standard, that's going to establish the artistic standard of South America, is going to be Chavín de Hontar, which is again located in this incredible spot that joins two rivers, two different types of mountain ranges, desert and jungle. Like it's almost like the center of the universe for these people. Like it combines all of these different terrain. And we can see so much of their religious beliefs and what we know because we don't really have much record. We don't have any writing. We don't have anything because they actually used a system of records of knots called quipu, which is impressive, but we just can't read it. So this civilization is going to kind of be that mother classical culture. It's what we will later see with the Incas. So Chavín de Hontar is a temple that has a new and old phase. So you've got like this higher part, and then you've got this sunk in part, which was meant to mirror like the ground and the mountains around it. So basically like making it a little model of the environment they saw behind them. And water could actually run through these underground tunnels, which as acoustic as they were, like the acoustics in these are one of the things that's most commented on because the sound like echoing off the walls would almost sound like the voices of the gods talking, like in this particular god in here, like this very spiritual cosmic place that they were in. So it may have been this idea that this place was the bridge between all of these worlds and giving it very high, religious significance. And as we've seen pretty much everywhere else, it's aligned with the cardinal directions to face towards the rising sun. And it was able to get a water source from the mountains and the snow melting off of it to give it kind of that, that spiritual effect within the actual temple itself. So this is the Great Temple, which we have found would have been topped with a jaguar. So remember, like the jaguar is this huge symbol of power in the Americas. It's in India, it's elephants and tigers. In Africa, it's lions and elephants. In the Americas, it's definitely the jaguar, especially Meso in South America. Because remember, that jaguar, can see at night. It can see into two worlds. It's got two different colors. It likes water and it likes earth. So therefore, it was kind of like to be a jaguar or to become a jaguar was like the highest thing that you could probably achieve, basically. So this is a reconstruction of what this would look like. And you can see it's located here along like these two geographical realms alongside of what is Peru today. And this was a huge pilgrimage site, like a place of people to come and visit and worship and see. And it was not meant for like the outer part may have been used for like priestly ceremonies and like actual religious rites, but the interior temple itself was much more about a private experience. In fact, we don't know if like everyday people were allowed inside of it. Like maybe only the priests and like truly enlightened people could go inside because it's kind of like Lakshmana and Hindu temples that it was meant to be more of a personal experience. So let's take a look at the inside. Okay, so they showed really good views of walking through the temple, and you can see just how dark and like confined it was to kind of make sure that the acoustics echoing off of that. And if you think about it, sound has always been an important part of art to several people. The cathedral basilicas that were adopted by the Christians, they liked the idea of the apse at the end of the church and adopting that for the basilica because it could be good for the acoustics during mass and during ceremony. So this was actually taken into consideration here. So when you walk into this temple, you're going through all of these underground hallways. And some of them were connected and some of them weren't. So maybe it was a little bit of a maze with this idea that only the true believers could find this Lanzon stela or this Lanzon stone, which is located in the center of Shevindahuntar. And so they believe that this is actually dedicated to the god that this temple was for. Now they call it the Lanzon, or the Spanish did, because to them it looked like a spear. And Lanzon is the name for spear. But actually, we have found from archaeological evidence that this is actually the shape of a tool that they would use for plowing. So it's much more likely that this was actually a god of agriculture. So maybe there were sacrifices given to this god so that the food would grow and they would have a successful, plantation or harvest. So we do know that there are slots at the top of it where wine or water or things could be given for this god to drink as kind of a sacrifice of it. So like watering the earth symbolically. And people would come to visit this, and it's got two sides of it that are exactly the same. So it's almost like when you cut a heart out and you do it just on one side of the paper, but then you open it up and you can see the whole thing. This is the same thing as that. So like if you were to open it up as they showed, you would see the two sides of it. So you can see here, this is one side, and on the other side of it, is it exactly the same thing? So it's a little bit hard to see, so I'll try to explain that you have all of these different animals combined into this, and some of them are dangerous and some of them are considered helpful. So you have a human body, and remember, it's very big on this animal spirit thing, like you're basically transitioning into animals, like embodying who they are. So it has animal claws and fangs, which were most likely based off of jaguars and caiman, which caiman were like alligators that lived in this area, which were smaller but pretty vicious, that could be very dangerous. So maybe this was like respecting those dangerous creatures and like showing respect for those, that this was a powerful being. And then you also have the eyebrows and fingertips that could become snakes. And remember, snakes in an agricultural society are a powerful thing because they do protect the crops, and they could go underground. So what you're seeing here is an example of something called contour rivalry, which means that each side of this, it's the same image on multiple sides. All right. So like if you were to open this up, it would be a mirror image on each side of it. So the idea was that this was meant to be very confusing. Like you can see that he's got an earring hanging down here, and that only if you were a true believer could you see the entire image all at the same time. Very similar to like the Zen gardens in Buddhism at Ryoanji that we talked about, where only through enlightenment could you see all 15 of the rocks. So this is what it would, so this is it from the side on the right. And then if you look at it on the left, that's what it would look like if you unfolded the thing. So like you could see both sides of it together, and the eye is looking up, and then one hand is looking up and one hand is looking down. So almost like a Buddhist mudra, where it's connecting this world to the next world, like showing that this connects to, the spirit world, and especially in terms of things needed for agriculture. So the relief sculptures that they have found on the inside and outside of Shevindahuntar, including the Lanzon stela, can be seen influencing art all over South America, because so many people came here and saw this that they created art that looks like this. So this idea of contour rivalry, of, you know, two sides that mirror each other, kind of like that duality of heaven and earth, good and bad. You know, so we've got good creatures and bad creatures. And there's actually a term that we see this, it's called horror vacui, which means fear of empty or blank space. And we see that a lot in Shove to Huntar, that there is like no empty space, really. Like negative space, yes, but that negative space is still part of like an image. And like they seem to cover the entire thing. And there's this common theme of transitioning or connection between animals and humans that's going to be very common in art that we see even outside of Shove to Huntar. So this is actually some of the exterior stones, that 100 relief statues that showed slowly a human becoming a jaguar. So kind of like becoming this all-seeing, all-understanding being, powerful being, from, you know, the right appropriate types of worship. So again, we talked about it, why the jaguar. He's the symbol of everything. He's what the lion is to Africa. He's what the tiger is to India. Like, the name is he who kills with one blow. So kind of showing just how powerful this was. All right. So second, you know, only to the snake god, basically. So this is actually kind of cool. So this is actually a nose ring that you're looking right here. So it would go like this, and then the snakes would kind of come out like this. And this nose ring was found nowhere near the Chavin, but it was found along a path going to the Shove to Huntar. So kind of like a trade network between it. And this would show that what we see in the artwork at Shove to Huntar influenced artwork that we see in other places. So like this in particular, we can kind of see that contour rivalry of mirror images on each side, that dual imagery of good and bad. And maybe that by wearing something like this, it would have given power to the wearer or would have shown elite status. All right. So this is kind of an impressive piece to show how much the shoving influenced other areas. This is just another example of contour rivalry, where it's like, if you folded it in half, it'd be the same image on each side. All right, so we're going to stop there. And our next lecture, we'll pick up with the Inca, who are going to kind of build back up from the Chavin and create this South American empire.